Good morning, Ryan Nobles. Good morning.
Hey, Bill Keeler. How are you, my friend? Good to hear your voice as always.
Have you have you spent much time in Florida this week?
No,
the last time I saw you, you were Hurricane Central.
Yes. No, I was fortunate enough, unlike some of my colleagues, that I got out of there on Thursday afternoon.
Okay.
Tallahassee ended up not getting hit as badly as we thought it was going to. It was actually kind of funny. Not funny is not the right word, but it was actually interesting to see the eye wall and how it kind of skirted around the outside of Tallahassee. So we spent all day expecting the big winds and rain to hit us, and it did get bad at certain points, but we never had that sustained, really heavy mess that they had down on the coast. So I got lucky. And the other big thing I need to make sure everybody knows is that my hotel never lost power, which is a huge aspect of the comfort level when covering a hurricane. Most of my colleagues did not have that luxury, so I got off easy. I don't think any doubt about that.
Ryan, you said something about the eye wall. I saw like really eerie but really interesting videos from inside the actual eye of the storm. Were you able to? You talked about seeing that you got the Tallahassee kind of got that eye wall. Did you get to see any of that?
Well, the eye didn't make its way over top of Tallahassee. We just caught the end of it. But you could see it's pretty. If you've never been in a hurricane before, it is actually pretty incredible to see the way the wind moves. It actually moves in kind of this round circle of where you are. So it's not like a tornado where it's like kind of a tight cyclone that you can see, but it's more of kind of a big sweeping circle, and it picks up so much debris and everything that you can actually see it happen. And when at its highest intensity, you'd have these big, massive wind gusts. It only got up to about 70 miles an hour in Tallahassee. And the rain would be going sideways along with you, and it would actually push you off your feet because you weren't ready for it. And then it would calm down again, and then the wind would come back around as it was making its turn around this circle. So a hurricane is a very unique weather event. It's like really nothing else you can compare to.
Yeah, and interestingly, as I said, you could have been impaled, and the guy on the Weather Channel almost was, for God's sakes.
Right.
That's crazy.
And, our guys down in Panama City, John Berman, our anchor, and Diane Gallagher, who's a good friend of mine, they were smart. They were in a spot where they had a protection to prevent, to give them a level of security if there were some sort of flying debris. But they had a huge piece of metal awning that came flying off and went right past both of their heads.
Wow.
I mean, on television, it looked a lot worse than it was. They were never in any real danger because they took proper precautions. But, man, when those winds get kicking up, they'll pick up anything and take it, and that's why you got to be careful.
I want to go, obviously, to politics here and get your take. What will it be like with a female president on House of Cards? which is debuting.
Where are we going here?
It's so funny how that program, I just thought, now, of course, with Kevin Spacey gone, his wife is now becoming president of the United States, and how that show seemed like so crazy. And now I look at it and I'm like, there's nothing they can do to wow me anymore because we're living a real-life House of Cards right now. It's crazy.
That was always my complaint about House of Cards when people would ask me what it's like to cover politics in Washington and how it compares to House of Cards. And the reason I never really got into House of Cards like other people did, I mean, I've watched it all, but I never loved it like I've liked other shows, is because it seemed too over the top. And living in this, I just like, this doesn't happen. There's no reporters getting pushed into subways and things like that. Yeah. And but in terms of over the topness, you're absolutely right. Our reality has become way more bizarre than what's actually what people in Hollywood can dream up. So I think you're right. I don't know what House of Cards could possibly do to match it.
And we're on such overload with politics. It seems every moment, and it's not just people who work in the business. I mean, look what we're going through here in the 22nd. I was talking to a reporter from Fox this morning and reminded him that our 22nd congressional race began in June of last year is when Anthony Brindisi declared his candidacy.
Right. And what's funny, Bill, is and you guys are getting it pretty good because you live in one of the most highly contested districts in the country. But having traveled around the country a little bit over this past year, it's pretty interesting, that there are pockets of America where people are just not paying that close attention to politics, which is pretty incredible. And I do think so. I do think Americans are engaged overall at maybe a higher level than they've ever been before. And I do think a lot of them are going to be participating in the election, which I think is an important distinction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're paying attention to every little tiny machination of what happens in the Trump White House or in the Russia investigation, or which cabinet secretary is in this job, or which UN ambassador stepping down, or whatever the case may be. And I think that when you actually see what's happening in these congressional races, and I don't know if it is perfectly aligned with what's happening in yours, but in many of these congressional races, they're not talking about Russia. They're not talking about Donald Trump. They're talking about the economy. They're talking about health care. They're talking about jobs, which are really more these kind of bread and butter issues that people make their political decisions on. And I wonder, I don't know what this means for the election, but I do think it's an important calculation we have to keep in the back of our mind.
And speaking of the Mueller investigation and the Russia investigation, it's been very quiet over the last couple of weeks.
Right, and that's what we expected. Usually when you get in this window before an election, about 60 days out from an election, the Justice Department usually takes a step back. That doesn't mean they're not still investigating, and Robert Mueller, special counsel, is essentially a branch of the Justice Department, but they're not going to be public in the work that they do. They're not necessarily going to call witnesses that could leak information out to the general public. They're not going to file any indictments, which you've seen he hasn't done that in this 60-day window.
Yeah.
But the sense that we're getting is that as soon as the midterms wrap up, that you could see more indictments fall. And then the big one, when Mueller actually hands his final assessment of President Trump's involvement in all of this over to Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, that's perhaps when the Mueller investigation will finally wrap up. And maybe that could happen by the end of the year. And then that's probably what we'll deal with in 2019 is the fallout from that as we get into 2020.
You have another thing going on right now that I find interesting. The president really criticizing the media around the world for another example of guilty before proven guilty. And he obviously referenced the Supreme Court, but we're talking about Saudi Arabia here. But with the midterms out there looming, Senate members and Republicans in the House are talking very, very tough on Saudi Arabia. So there does seem to be a bit of divide there.
This is the one thing I was thinking about President Trump last night that I find so fascinating is that he has no problem quickly judging and attacking people who most people would probably assume are at a lower status than him or could potentially be weaker than him, right? So the best example this week would be Stormy Daniels, right? He has no problem going on Twitter and calling her an awful name and, attacking Michael Avenatti, her attorney, and doing so in a really derisive way. But then here you have Saudi Arabia, perhaps a powerful foe and somebody that can challenge the president at his level, and he is so reluctant to say anything negative about them. The same can be said about North Korea, and the same can be said about Vladimir Putin. For some reason, he has no problem attacking people that are further down the chain, but those that are perhaps equal to him or maybe even at a level above him, he seems to cower away from. And I just don't understand that. The evidence in this case seems to be pretty convincing as to what happened. This guy walked into a Saudi consulate, which is a place where, as a Saudi Arabian, which is what he was, should feel comfortable.
Yeah, it should be a safe haven.
And he never walks out. There's something suspicious there, right? There's something that the Saudi government's responsible for on some level, and it goes from either just outright negligence to they actually murdered him, which seems to be the more likely scenario. And shouldn't the President of the United States be a little bit more forceful in that? And it's not just, I can understand to make the argument from a diplomatic standpoint, right? Well, Saudi Arabia is an important ally. There's a lot of security and financial issues that are tied up with Saudi Arabia. But there's still a tone question about this, right? The President almost seems to be not that interested in it. It doesn't seem as important to him as it does to some other people. Yeah. And he seems more concerned about the arms deals that we have with Saudi Arabia and their access to oil and his relationship with the Crown Prince. That seems to be more important to him than this person's life. And then what it says more broadly about the freedom of the press and the ability to criticize your government. This sends a message to other totalitarian regimes around the country that, hey, you know, you could probably do stuff like this, and Donald Trump's not going to give you a hard time about it.
Yeah. Obviously, the president's come off some pretty big wins, and it does seem to. I guess you can just take a look at a feeling that you might have, and you look at the stories that are out there and the news. You get this feel that if that this Mueller, the Supreme Court issue with Kavanaugh has been a pretty big bump for Republicans. Not just energizing the Republican base, but it does seem that there's some of those in the middle that, at least people that I've spoken to who say they were undecided, it's kind of helped push them one way or the other. And I really feel leaning to the right, to the Republicans.
Well, here's the thing, Bill. This is the key for Donald Trump in the midterms, right? The biggest problem that he has electorally is by people that are, and I'm not even going to call them Republicans, but people who are not inclined to vote for Democrats but are not a fan of him, right? And so in each one of these congressional races, you might be able to hold your nose and vote for Claudia Tenney, for instance, because she's not Donald Trump, because you support the policies of the Republican Party. And so what these wins that Donald Trump has had over the past few months, the Kavanaugh hearing being one, the economy doing well, he figured out this NAFTA thing. I think that trade deal is a big thing that I don't think a lot of people are giving enough attention to. If you're a traditional Republican, you're looking at this stuff and you're saying, you know what? I kind of like that he's doing all these things. I don't necessarily like the way he conducts himself as a human being, but these are the policies that I support.
Yeah.
And this Republican member of Congress who I support has supported those policies. I'm going to come home to the Republican Party, and I'm still going to vote Republican, even though I'm not necessarily a fan of Donald Trump personally. And that's not a huge portion of the electorate. It might only be 10 to 15%. But, man, that 10 to 15% could be the difference between a 3-point victory or a 5-point loss. I still think – go ahead.
I think you're absolutely right. I believe you're absolutely right. I spoke with one constituent yesterday here in the 22nd who said, I just fear that if the Democrats were to take control of the House, it would become so crazy and we would get so sidetracked. The economy would take the brunt of it. And I think people are feeling like, boy, this is a good time. Let's not screw it up right now.
Right, and you can tell that definitively with the Republican messaging and all these points, right?
Yeah.
What are the things that they're attacking Democrats in these races for? And I'm sure these talking points are Claudia Tenney's as well. Anthony Brindisi is just going to be another vote for Nancy Pelosi. Mm-hmm. He's going to push for impeachment. He wants to abolish ICE. He wants to, and I'm just saying this broadly because this is what's happening in congressional races all around the country. And, and in many of these congressional races, these Democratic candidates have said specifically that they're not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, that they're not interested in impeachment.
Yeah.
But yet that is effective messaging because I do feel that it's kind of an interesting position, and this is really smart politics on behalf of the Republicans. Americans are sick of chaos to a certain extent. They're fatigued by what's happened in the last 2 years in the Trump administration, and Republicans have actually made an effective argument that the way to prevent more chaos is to allow them to stay in charge.
Yeah.
Because if you put Democrats in charge of the House, we're just going to have a new level of chaos that it comes from impeachment and obstruction and more infighting.
Yeah.
It's a tough argument to make, but they're somehow doing it.
They are. And listen, if they, I do think you get the tone. You even on the Sunday morning programs, the feel is that the odds are in the favor of the Democrats to take control of the House. But in the last week or so, Republicans have put themselves in a position where I got to tell you, it's going to be a race. It could very well be tight, and they could hold on to the House. It really has been interesting.
Bill, I encourage you to check out our new website on CNN that's connected to the podcast I told you about last week, the Forecast. If you look for the Forecast on CNN.com, Harry Enton, who's my co-host on the podcast, talks, he looks at this all from a very data-driven, analytical perspective. And the problem the Democrats have in the Senate side and the Republicans have in the House side is just the demographic makeup of most of these districts. And even though you're right, maybe there's a tone shift and Republicans are feeling a little buoyed on the House side, it's still going to be very difficult for them to hold on to the House just by the way these district maps are carved and the way that the map makes up. But on the Senate side, there was once this kind of faint hope by Democrats that if there was this blue wave, that it could take an unfavorable map on the Senate side, and then they'd be able to take over the Senate. It's looking increasingly unlikely that Democrats are going to be able to do that. So under the most rosy circumstance for Democrats, Donald Trump probably still ends up with at least a Republican Senate, which really makes impeachment and all these other things a much more difficult proposition for Democrats. So, Democrats are still pretty energized. We shouldn't overanalyze this kind of new good feeling for Republicans, because I still think that Democrats on election night are probably going to be a lot happier than Republicans. But Bill, if 2016 taught us anything, we should not be predicting anything.
And I think that's part of this is that how often have we heard, well, there's no chance that they can win. There's no chance he can win. And what happened in 2016 makes people believe, I'm not sure you can trust anything at this point until it's all said and done. One last thing before I let you go. Lindsey Graham, there's rumor out there that part of it, because he's taken a new biting tone. And people have said, well, since John McCain has died, Lindsey Graham is kind of set free to I'm hearing, though, that a lot of that was about his race. The things had tightened in his race. And going out as strong as he did in support of Kavanaugh just won him re-election. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a 2020 calculation for Lindsey Graham. So he's up for re-election in 2020, not as to run for president. He's up for re-election in 2020 in South Carolina, and he's not worried about losing a general election. He's scared to death that he's going to get primaried by a Trump Republican.
Right.
And so he needs to shore up the Republican side of the equation, and the only way that he can do that is by cozying back up to Donald Trump. And you see that in his language. You see that in what he's said over the past couple of days. The thing about Lindsey Graham is he was a hardcore anti-Trumper during the presidential election, but he always said that he was going to give Donald Trump a chance.
Yeah.
He's taken a calculation here that it's better for him to be buddies with Donald Trump on a number of levels, and there's absolutely a political calculation involved in it, and I think that's why you see him going the direction that he's going.
Certainly, he did energize. He energized the base with his speech, the speech that he gave during the Kavanaugh hearings. That really lit a fire into the whole process.
Well, it's interesting. I just think, the whole thing about Lindsey Graham and John McCain that was kind of their calling card was that they were the ones that, we're Republicans, make no mistake, but we're the ones that can work with people on the other side of the aisle. And if you watch that speech and you saw the reaction to it, if you were a conservative Republican, you thought it was the greatest thing you've ever seen.
Yep.
And if you were a Democrat, you thought it was the most awful thing you've ever seen.
Yeah.
And that's generally not the space Lindsey Graham finds himself in, which I think that's why people are so interested in his kind of evolution here.
And who gets energized more? That's the big question we'll find out in November. So, all right, Ryan, good stuff. Thanks so much. We'll do it again next week. Ryan Nobles from CNN.
I probably will be in Florida next week.
Okay.
So I know you like to be there. So
from a warmer climate. Okay, cool.
All right,
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.